In the village of Ijibu, nestled between the lush forests and rolling hills, Adesewa was on her way home from the market one evening when she saw something that would haunt her for days. The air was heavy with the scent of palm trees and the distant croaking of frogs, and the fading sunlight cast long shadows on the dusty path. As she walked, her basket of pepper balanced on her head, she heard a commotion nearby. Her eyes fell upon two men harassing a young woman near the village outskirts. The woman, bruised and terrified, caught sight of Adesewa and locked eyes with her, silently pleading for help. "Help me," the woman's voice quivered. Adesewa froze for a moment, heart pounding. The men turned their heads in her direction, sensing another presence, but before they could see her clearly, she bolted, disappearing into the shadows of the nearby trees. She ran until she was sure she was out of sight and didn't stop until she reached her home. Her heart still raced as she tried to shake off the image of the terrified woman. The next morning, as Adesewa made her way to the market to sell her goods, she noticed a crowd gathered at the very spot where the incident had occurred the previous night. Curiosity tugged at her, but she resisted the urge to get involved. From a distance, she saw a woman cradling the lifeless body of the young lady she had seen being attacked. The scene was tragic, but Adesewa convinced herself it was none of her business and continued to the market, where the murder was the only topic of conversation. By midday, word had spread throughout the village that anyone with information should report to the chief. Adesewa said nothing. 2 days later, her quiet life was disturbed when palace guards arrived at her home and escorted her to the chief's court. There, a young hunter claimed to have seen her fleeing from the scene on the night of the murder. He described how, moments after she ran, two men emerged from the same spot, laughing. The chief asked Adesewa to confirm the identity of the men standing before her. She glanced at them, her expression blank. "I didn't see anything," she replied coldly. The mother of the murdered girl broke down, begging Adesewa to speak the truth, but Adesewa remained unmoved. She left the palace without a second glance, her heart hardened against the cries of the grieving mother. That night, disturbed by the events, Adesewa packed her belongings and left the village for a short vacation to a nearby island where her childhood friend, Ngozi, still lived. The small island was almost deserted, with most of its inhabitants having moved to the mainland over the years. Only Ngozi, her husband, their young daughter, and a few elderly villagers remained. Upon her arrival, Ngozi welcomed Adesewa warmly, showing her the house where she had grown up, now cleaned and prepared for her stay. The two women spent the afternoon reminiscing about their youth, the laughter and mischief of their younger days. As the sun began to set, Ngozi hurried home, remembering she hadn't yet prepared dinner for her family. At Ngozi's home, things were far from peaceful. That evening, her husband, enraged by the delay in his meal, beat her savagely while her brother-in-law and mother-in-law watched in silence. After the beating, her husband threw some medicinal leaves at her, instructing her to heal herself. As Ngozi got up to clean herself, she noticed something that sent chills down her spine. Her daughter's underwear was peeking out of her husband's trousers. Fear and rage gripped her heart, and she made a decision. She could endure the abuse directed at her, but she would not allow her daughter to suffer the same fate. The next morning, Ngozi confided in Adesewa about her situation, revealing her plan to escape with her daughter. But Adesewa, weary from her own troubles, was indifferent and told her friend she planned to return home soon. Later that day, Ngozi made her move. She took her daughter and ran toward a boat at the edge of the island, desperate to escape. Just as she was untying the rope, her husband caught up to her, dragging her out of the boat. He beat her viciously, and when their daughter tried to intervene, he shoved the child aside. The girl hit her head on a rock and died instantly. A horrified silence fell over the island. Everyone blamed Ngozi for what happened, accusing her of pushing her husband to such violence. That evening, as grief consumed the island, Ngozi's brother-in-law brought a bowl of soup to Adesewa. Exhausted, She drank it without suspicion and soon fell into a deep sleep. But unbeknownst to him, Ngozi entered the room shortly after and sat beside her friend. Her presence thwarted whatever sinister plan her brother-in-law had in mind, and he left quietly. As Ngozi sat there, memories of their childhood flooded her mind, the time they had been harassed by boys in the forest, and Adesewa had fled, leaving her behind. Nothing had happened to her back then, but the memory lingered, a silent wound. The next morning, Adesewa woke to a chilling silence. The island, already quiet with its few inhabitants, felt even more desolate. She wandered outside, sensing something was wrong. Then she heard a scream. Racing toward the sound, she found one of the elderly women on the edge of a cliff, begging for her life. Ngozi, drenched in blood, stood over her with a knife. "Stop!" Adesewa cried, but it was too late. Ngozi struck, and the woman fell to her death. Then, slowly, Ngozi turned to face her friend, a sad smile on her lips. "I'm sorry for everything," she whispered, before leaping off the cliff herself. Adesewa stood frozen, watching as her childhood friend disappeared into the abyss. Without a word, she returned to the boat and sailed back to her village. Upon arrival, she walked straight to the palace, her expression cold and distant. She confirmed the identities of the men who had attacked the young woman days earlier, and they were swiftly stoned to death by the villagers. The people praised Adesewa for her bravery, but she said nothing. She simply returned to her home, laid down on her mat, and closed her eyes, as if to shut out the world that had become too dark for her to bear.